My name is Madeline, 32 years old. While I stood completely alone in the pouring rain at my grandfather Walter's memorial, the man who sheltered me when my parents cast me out at age 12, my own mother and father Mark and Keelan were clinking champagne glasses at an 21%. Elite real estate gala in Aspen, posting photos, captioned, "Number building our empire." Not a single call, not one flower, not even a fake "I'm sorry." They chose a networking event over their own father's grave. 4 hours later, my phone buzzed. A text from Walter's number, even though he had been dead for 4 days. It said, "Madeline, this is Nora, his care manager. Come to Oakwood Haven room 4B. Now, before they delete everything." What Nora handed me in a battered tin drafting tube would expose a meticulously calculated $850,000 cold-blooded betrayal and turn my parents' perfect high society triumph into their worst nightmare. Before I tell you what was inside that tube, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of story. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every single comment. Now, to understand how deep this betrayal goes, I need to take you back to when I was 12 years old. The memory of the day I was discarded does not play back in my mind with screaming or dramatic tears. It plays back in a suffocating clinical silence. I was exactly 12 years old. The Georgia summer heat was pressing against the tinted windows of Mark's luxury sedan. I sat in the back seat clutching the straps of my small canvas suitcase. In the front, Mark gripped the leather steering wheel, his jaw-tight eyes fixed strictly on the road ahead. Keelan sat in the passenger seat, meticulously reapplying her expensive nude lipstick in the visor mirror. They did not look back at me. They had spent the entire morning explaining their decision with the cold, detached terminology of a corporate merger. Mark had stated that their new real estate ventures required them to relocate frequently to the West Coast. Keelan had added, without breaking eye contact with her reflection, that taking a child along would simply be a logistical liability for their growing portfolio. I was not a daughter to them. I was an underperforming asset they were writing off. The tires crunched loudly as Mark turned the car onto the long gravel driveway of Walter's estate in Savannah. The property was a stunning, sprawling piece of history shaded by massive oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. Mark threw the car into park but left the engine running. The low hum of the exhaust felt like a ticking timer. Keelan did not even unbuckle her seatbelt. "Hurry up, Madeline," she sighed, checking her diamond watch. "We have a flight to catch." I opened the heavy car door and stepped out into the humid air. I pulled my suitcase from the trunk. As I dragged it up the stone steps to the heavy wooden front door, the car engine revved. Walter opened the door before I could even knock. He was a towering man, a retired structural engineer whose hands were perpetually rough from working with timber, yet his eyes held a profound, quiet kindness. He looked at me, then looked past me at the idling car. He didn't shout. He didn't run down the steps to demand an explanation from his own son. Walter simply understood the immense cruelty of the moment. Mark put the car in reverse, the tires spinning slightly in the gravel, and pulled away. Keelan never once turned her head to look out the window. I stood on the stone porch, a 12-year-old girl watching the glowing red taillights of her parents' car disappear down the oak-lined avenue, taking my childhood with them. Walter placed a heavy, warm hand on my trembling shoulder. He guided me inside out of the blinding sun and closed the heavy door firmly behind us. They never looked back. 20 years later, I stand in the historic district of Savannah, running my bare hands over the exposed, weathered brick of a 19th-century building. I am 32 years old, and I am a preservation architect. My entire career is dedicated to saving things that society deems broken, forgotten, or no longer useful. I find structural integrity in things others want to demolish. It is not a coincidence that I chose this path. It is a direct reflection of what Walter did for me. While Mark and Keelan spent the next 2 decades flipping modern, soulless properties for quick, superficial profits, Walter taught me the quiet, enduring value of a solid foundation. Growing up in his house was an education in stability. He was a master of load-bearing walls of tension and of resilience. Our sanctuary was his sprawling backyard workshop. It always smelled beautifully of fresh cedar shavings, old paper, and strong black coffee. While other girls my age were learning about makeup and trends, Walter was standing behind a massive wooden drafting table showing me how to read complex architectural blueprints. He would trace the intricate blue and white lines with a thick pencil, explaining how the weight of a structure must be distributed evenly, or the entire building will inevitably collapse. "People are exactly like buildings, Madeline," he would tell me, his voice, a low, comforting rumble. "If the foundation is built on lies or cheap materials, it doesn't matter how pretty the paint is on the outside. A storm will come and it will fall. You build your life on truth, and you will weather anything." He gave me that truth. He gave me a foundation. For 20 years, Walter was the only parent I knew. We had a sacred Sunday morning ritual. Every single week without fail, I would sit at his kitchen table with the faded blue tablecloth. I would draft my architectural designs, and he would drink his coffee, simply enjoying the quiet companionship. He showed up for my high school graduation. He sat in the front row when I received my master's degree. He celebrated my first major architectural commission. During all those monumental milestones, Mark and Keelan were merely ghosts, existing only as distant, shiny figures on social media feeds boasting about their rising net worth. I did not miss them. I had Walter, and his presence was absolute, unwavering, and deeply rooted in genuine love. He took a discarded, broken 12-year-old girl and meticulously rebuilt her into a strong, independent woman. He was my only foundation. The cracks in my perfectly structured life began to show in the late autumn of the year Walter turned 78. The decline was subtle at first. A slight tremor in his strong hands when he tried to hold his drafting pencil. A momentary confusion when navigating the familiar streets of downtown Savannah. The doctors diagnosed it as the early manageable stages of cognitive decline, complicated by a failing heart. It was painful to watch the strongest man I knew begin to physically falter, but I was fully prepared to care for him. I had already begun converting the first floor of his historic home to accommodate his changing mobility needs. I had a schedule. I had a plan. I was going to protect him exactly the way he had protected me. Then the ghosts materialized. It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon when a pristine black luxury SUV crunched up the gravel driveway. I watched through the front window as the doors opened. Mark and Keelan stepped out. I had not seen them in the flesh for 20 years, yet they looked exactly as they portrayed themselves online, flawlessly preserved, wrapped in designer fabrics exuding a sharp manufactured wealth. Keelan adjusted her oversized sunglasses, looking up at the majestic architecture of Walter's home. She wasn't looking at it with nostalgia. She was scanning it with the cold, calculating eyes of a real estate appraiser. Mark adjusted his custom-tailored suit jacket, wearing a completely unearned expression of familial concern. They stood on the very same stone steps where they had abandoned me. When I opened the door, Keelan immediately reached out, attempting to embrace me, while engulfed in a cloud of heavy, expensive perfume. "Madeline, darling," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "We heard about your grandfather's health. We came as soon as we could. We are family after all." The word family tasted like ash in the air. Mark pushed past me, stepping into the grand foyer, immediately noting the original hardwood floors and the antique chandeliers. They claimed they wanted to reconnect. They claimed they had matured, that their empire was stable, and that they now had the resources to ensure Walter received the absolute premium care he desperately needed. Later that evening, I found Walter in his workshop. He was staring quietly at a battered tin drafting tube resting on his workbench. He didn't look at Mark or Keelan. He looked at me, his eyes momentarily sharp, completely devoid of any cognitive fog. He pulled the tin tube toward him, his trembling hand resting firmly on the metal cap. He didn't speak a word about my parents' sudden miraculous return. He just looked at the tube, then back at me, conveying a silent, urgent warning that I was too naive to fully decipher at the time. The predators were circling. Looking back, the most agonizing question I ask myself is why I did not immediately throw them out. Why did I, a fiercely independent architect who rigorously controlled every aspect of her life, simply step aside and allow Mark and Keelan to infiltrate Walter's home? To understand this failure, you have to understand the invisible, psychological chains that bind a survivor of childhood. Abandonnement. When the people who brought you into this world look you in the eye and decide you are not worth keeping, it leaves a microscopic, enduring fracture in your psyche. You spend decades pouring concrete over that fracture. You build a successful career, you forge a new identity, and you convince yourself that you are entirely whole. But deep down in the darkest, most irrational corner of the mind, a desperate, wounded 12-year-old still wonders if she was the problem. When Mark and Keelan returned wielding their soft voices, their polished apologies, and their checkbooks, they intentionally exploited that specific fracture. Keelan would sit at the kitchen table, invading the sacred space where Walter and I used to draft, and place her perfectly manicured hand over mine. "You look exhausted, Madeline," she would say, her eyes swimming with masterfully fabricated empathy. "You have your firm to run. You shouldn't have to carry the burden of elder care all alone. Let your father and me handle the doctors. Let us take care of the paperwork. You just focus on being his granddaughter." It was the ultimate psychological trap. Society constantly reinforces the toxic narrative that family is absolute, that blood eventually heals all wounds, and that forgiveness is a mandatory virtue. I was paralyzed by a condition psychologists call learned helplessness. Despite knowing their history of supreme selfishness, a treacherous part of me wanted to believe that age had softened them. I wanted to believe that facing Walter's mortality had finally sparked a dormant conscience within them. I normalized their sudden, overwhelming intrusion because it was easier than confronting the terrifying reality that my parents were utterly incapable of love. So, I compromised. I told myself that letting them handle the complex medical insurance forms and the grueling hospital appointments was the logical, efficient choice. I convinced myself that I was managing the situation, preserving my energy, so I could spend quality emotional time with Walter. I handed them the administrative keys to his life, believing I was accepting a peace offering. I didn't realize I was handing the keys to a pair of ruthless corporate raiders. Hope is a dangerous trap. The takeover of Walter's life was not a sudden, violent event. It was a perfectly executed, meticulously planned, hostile acquisition. Mark and Keelan did not just walk in and lock the heavy wooden doors of the estate. They built the barricades slowly, using my own dedication to my career against me. It started with our sacred Sunday drafting sessions. For 20 years, those mornings were my sanctuary. By late November, the passive-aggressive text messages began. Keelan would message me early in the morning. "Walter is experiencing severe fatigue today. His new cardiology team highly recommends absolute isolation to stabilize his heart rate." The tone was always masterfully crafted, dripping with a synthesized artificial concern that made it impossible to argue without appearing wildly unreasonable. I was knee-deep in a high-stakes preservation project, working 14-hour days to save a 19th-century municipal library from being bulldozed by commercial developers. I was exhausted, and I allowed their carefully constructed narrative to pacify my protective instincts. When I tried to call the landline at the historic estate to hear his voice, the phone would simply ring into the void. Keelan eventually informed me that the old rotary phone was becoming too confusing for his declining cognitive state. They seamlessly replaced it with a locked-down mobile device. A device that highly conveniently only seemed to accept incoming calls from their registered phone numbers. Whenever I pushed back and demanded to speak with him directly, Mark would immediately step in, utilizing aggressive corporate-style language to shut me down. "We are managing his stress levels, Madeline. You are overwhelming his fragile system with your anxiety. Let the professionals handle this." I did what many overwhelmed adult children do. I rationalized the isolation. I told myself that Mark and Keelan possessed the massive financial resources required to provide the round-the-clock premium nursing care that Walter deserved. I told myself that stepping back and focusing on my architectural deadlines was the mature, selfless choice. I did not realize that they were systematically dismantling his entire existence. They weaponized the complex architecture of medical privacy laws, invoking HIPAA regulations and vague legal clauses to build an impenetrable legal fortress around him. They became his absolute, unquestioned gatekeepers. I was reduced to a distant, managed spectator receiving curated, sterilized updates via brief text messages. I trusted the process, assuming that beneath their polished, greedy exteriors they possessed a baseline of human decency. I assumed they would finally act like a family. It was a devastating, monumental miscalculation. The silence was heavily orchestrated. By early spring, the updates from Keelan had dwindled from weekly messages to generic monthly copy-and-paste emails regarding his stable but resting condition. I would frequently drive my car past the grand iron gates of the Savannah estate on my way home from the construction site. The sweeping oak trees looked identical, but the house itself was eerily dark. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight across the bay windows. The warm, inviting glow that always emanated from Walter's backyard workshop was permanently extinguished. I rationalized this chilling emptiness by assuming they had transferred him to one of the premier luxury neurological rehabilitation centers they were always boasting about in their high society networking circles. I assumed he was resting in a suite overlooking a manicured garden. The illusion shattered violently on a Tuesday morning. It was 6:45. The sky outside my apartment window was still a bruised pre-dawn gray, and the rain was already lashing against the glass. My phone vibrated aggressively on the nightstand. The caller ID displayed an unknown local number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but an unexplainable heavy dread settled deep in my chest. I accepted the call. "Is this Madeline?" a woman's voice asked. It was a professional, incredibly steady voice, carrying the distinct weight of someone entirely accustomed to delivering catastrophic news. "Yes, speaking," I replied, sitting up slowly. "My name is Nora. I am the care manager at Oakwood Haven. I am deeply sorry to inform you that Walter passed away this morning at 3:20. The words felt completely disconnected from the laws of physics. Oakwood Haven. I knew the architectural landscape of this city intimately. I knew every building, every zoning district. Oakwood Haven was not a premium medical facility. "There must be a massive clerical error," I replied, my voice completely devoid of panic. Maintaining a strict, analytical cadence. "My grandfather resides at his historic estate, or, at the very least, a specialized private clinic." A heavy, suffocating pause lingered on the telephone line. "Ma'am," Nora said gently, her voice breaking slightly. "Walter has been a resident in our state-subsidized memory care wing for exactly 8 months. 8 months. 240 days." A brilliant engineer who possessed a historic mansion and a savings account holding nearly $500,000 had been silently warehoused in a bleak, low-income facility for the better part of a year. And I had absolutely no idea. My hands turned to ice. They had buried him alive. The funeral was a masterclass in quiet, devastating dignity. I arranged every single detail myself within 48 hours. I completely bypassed the ornate, overpriced bronze options. The funeral director aggressively pushed and selected a simple, beautifully crafted solid oak casket. It was exactly the kind of unpretentious, sturdy woodwork Walter would have deeply respected. It rained relentlessly that afternoon, a cold Georgia downpour that soaked the few attendees. The crowd consisted mostly of retired union carpenters, with calloused hands and elderly neighbors who remembered his unwavering kindness. Mark and Keelan were noticeably glaringly absent. They did not answer my calls. They did not respond to my urgent emails detailing the cemetery arrangements. The moment the brief service concluded, I did not go home to grieve in the quiet of my apartment. I drove directly through the driving rain to the address Nora had provided over the phone. Oakwood Haven sat on the bleak industrial outskirts of the city, surrounded by cracked pavement and chain-link fences. The building's architecture was a depressing study in institutional neglect: flat, featureless cinder-block walls, barred windows, and a complete lack of natural light. It smelled intensely of industrial bleach, old medication, and boiled vegetables. I walked through the automatic sliding doors, my wet heels clicking sharply against the cheap peeling linoleum floor. I did not cry. My grief had completely solidified into a cold, hyper-focused, absolute clarity. The receptionist silently pointed me toward the second floor, room 4B. I pushed the flimsy, hollow-core wooden door open and stepped inside. The space was shockingly violently small. The walls were painted a sterile, nauseating institutional green that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. The single narrow window looked out over a rusted commercial dumpster in the alleyway. There was a stripped mechanical hospital bed and a single cracked plastic chair. That was the entirety of the space. This was the final environment of a brilliant structural engineer, a man who had built libraries, restored bridges, and engineered massive homes. A man who loved the rich scent of cedar and the absolute precision of a graphite blueprint. There was no drafting table. There were no tools. There was absolutely nothing in this room that reflected a life well lived or a mind that had created beauty. It was a holding cell, designed purely for maximum financial efficiency. I stood in the center of the sterile space, processing the sheer magnitude of the cruelty. Mark and Keelan had not merely relocated him. They had systematically stripped him of his dignity, his environment, and his identity. The room was utterly desolate. He always watched that heavy door, expecting you to walk through it. I turned slowly around. A woman in dark blue medical scrubs stood in the doorway. She had tired, deeply compassionate eyes and graying hair pulled back into a strict, tight bun. It was Nora. She stepped into the bleak room, crossing her arms tightly across her chest, as if trying to physically hold back her own intense frustration. I looked at her, my posture perfectly straight. "I don't understand the mechanics of this," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level, treating the situation like a structural failure analysis. "Why didn't anyone in this facility contact me? Why wasn't I on the approved medical visitor list?" Nora sighed, a deep, weary sound that echoed in the empty room. "Your parents presented absolute legally binding medical proxy and power of attorney documents the very hour they admitted him. They explicitly instructed our administration that you were dangerously estranged. Keelan filed supplemental paperwork claiming you suffered from severe emotional instability, stating that your physical presence caused Walter extreme psychological distress and erratic heart rhythms. Legally, our hands were completely, utterly tied by their documentation. The calculated, psychopathic precision of their lie was breathtaking. They had weaponized my demanding career and my natural introversion to paint a highly credible picture of a mentally unstable, greedy granddaughter. Did they actually visit him? I asked, shifting my gaze to the empty, cracked plastic chair in the corner. Nora's expression hardened instantly into pure, unfiltered disgust. Exactly once a month. Never for a single minute, more than 15 minutes. They would stride in together wearing expensive suits, carrying thick stacks of dense financial paperwork. Keelan would sit exactly where you are standing. She would hold his trembling hand, physically guiding his pen across the signature lines on the bank transfers. They would speak to him in loud, slow voices, exactly like he was a toddler who couldn't comprehend basic English. Nora stepped closer, her voice dropping to an urgent, fierce whisper. But Madeline, you need to understand something incredibly crucial. Your grandfather's body was failing him, but his mind was sharp as broken glass. He wasn't confused. He had a small, folded photograph of you in your graduation gown hidden in his blanket. He would weep silently when he looked at it. He knew exactly what they were doing to him, but he was physically trapped in that bed. He knew he couldn't physically fight them. He knew absolutely everything. Before Nora could elaborate on Walter's final days, my phone vibrated sharply in the pocket of my damp coat. I pulled it out. An email notification illuminated the cracked screen. It was sent directly from Keelan's corporate real estate account. The subject line read, Walter's arrangements. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the perfectly sanitized, emotionless block of text. Madeline, the email began. Mark and I are completely devastated by the sudden news of Dad's passing. Unfortunately, we are currently in Aspen, finalizing a massive multi-million-dollar commercial acquisition. This networking gala is absolutely critical for the expansion of our empire, and the logistics are strictly non-refundable. We completely trust your capability to handle the funeral logistics appropriately. We will reimburse any reasonable expenses upon our return. Our thoughts are with you. I read the words 3 times, analyzing the structure of their deceit. There was no sorrow. There was no regret. It was a cold transactional memo from a chief executive regarding a liquidated asset. They were drinking champagne while I was standing in the very cell where they had left my grandfather to die. I silently turned the phone around and handed it to Nora. She read the glowing screen, her jaw clenching so tightly I could see the muscle jumping violently in her cheek. Without uttering a single word, she turned on her heel and walked swiftly down the quiet hallway toward the secure staff locker room. When she returned 2 minutes later, she was carrying an object that made my heart physically stutter in my chest. It was a heavy, battered tin drafting tube, the exact specific kind Walter always used to store his most critical, irreplaceable architectural blueprints in the backyard workshop. The gray metal was deeply scratched and dented, holding decades of history and the faint, lingering smell of cedar wood. He kept this hidden deep under his mattress, Nora whispered, pressing the cold, heavy metal tube firmly into my hands. He made me swear on my absolute life that I would bypass standard facility protocols and give it directly to you the moment he passed. He told me they would assume he was too weak to document anything. He told me to give you a specific message when I handed this over. I looked at Nora, gripping the tin tube so tightly my knuckles turned entirely white. What did he say? I asked. Nora looked me dead in the eye, her voice echoing in the bleak room. He said, "Tell Madeline their foundation is built on sand." I finally held the truth. The drive back to my apartment was entirely a blur of sweeping windshield wipers and blinding streetlights. I did not turn on the radio. The heavy tin drafting tube sat on the passenger seat, radiating a strange magnetic gravity. When I finally unlocked my front door, I didn't bother taking off my damp coat. I walked directly to the massive angled drafting table in the center of my living room. I pushed aside the blueprints for a municipal library restoration project. I cleared the surface completely. I set the battered tin tube down under the harsh, bright glare of the architectural halogen lamp. The metal cap was rusted shut from the humidity, requiring me to grip it with both hands and twist with a sharp, violent motion. The seal broke with a loud crack that echoed in the silent apartment. I tipped the tube forward. A thick, tightly rolled cylindrical bundle of papers slid out, landing heavily on the smooth wood. I carefully unrolled the documents, placing heavy brass paperweights on the corners to keep them flat. The sheer volume of material was staggering. As I began to sort through the first layer, my breath caught in my throat. Walter had not just collected bank statements, he had engineered a flawless forensic audit. Beneath the original documents were dozens of sheets of thin blue carbon paper. Every single time Keelan or Mark had stood over his hospital bed aggressively, guiding his hand to sign away his assets, Walter had meticulously slid a piece of carbon paper beneath the signature line. He had kept exact physical duplicates of his own financial execution. The handwriting on the top copies was shaky, indicative of a man whose physical strength was actively failing. But the organization of the files was pristine. It was the precise, methodical mind of a master structural engineer at work. He had cross-referenced the dates of their 15-minute visits with the dates on the transfer slips. In the margins, written in his distinct, block-letter architectural handwriting, were brief, devastating notes. Keelan visited, claimed money needed for private cardiac specialist, did not see specialist. He was physically trapped in that bleak room at Oakwood Haven, but his intellect had never deteriorated. He was quietly, desperately building a case against his own son. He was assembling the raw materials I would need to construct their ultimate downfall. The trap was perfectly set. I spent the next 4 hours dissecting the financial anatomy of their betrayal. I did not need magical hacking skills or dramatic corporate espionage. I simply followed the fundamental rule of any structural investigation: trace the load-bearing elements. In this case, I followed the money. I aligned Walter's carbon copies with the bank statements he had successfully intercepted from the facility's mailroom. The math was brutally straightforward. In February, $35,000 was wired out. In April, $60,000. By August, the transfers escalated to six figures. A lifetime of disciplined savings earned through decades of breathing in sawdust and pouring concrete was being systematically siphoned out of his First National account. I booted up my laptop and accessed the state's public business registry. I typed in the routing numbers and the receiving entity listed on the wire transfers: Apex Horizon Holdings LLC. The database search took less than 4 seconds. The registered agent for the LLC was Keelan. The primary business address was a luxury high-rise condominium in downtown Atlanta. They had liquidated nearly $450,000 of his cash assets to funnel directly into their own commercial development firm. But the most damning piece of evidence was not the bank statements themselves. It was the mechanism they used to authorize the theft. Buried in the middle of the stack was a photocopy of a durable financial power of attorney. The document granted Mark and Keelan absolute, unquestioned control over Walter's entire estate. I analyzed the signature. It was Walter's name, but the pen strokes were jagged and hesitant, clearly executed while he was heavily medicated. But that wasn't the fatal structural flaw. As a preservation architect, my eyes are trained to catch microscopic discrepancies in dates and permits. I looked at the notary seal stamped cleanly at the bottom of the page. The document was dated and notarized in late January. I zoomed in on the notary's commission expiration text. The commission had explicitly expired the previous November. Mark and Keelan had been so arrogant, so rushed to secure the funds for their Aspen project, that they had utilized an invalid notary. The document was legally worthless. The math never lies. The cash transfers were only the surface-level damage. The true depth of their sociopathy was documented in the final, thickest envelope at the bottom of the tin tube. I slid my fingernail under the flap and pulled out a heavy stack of legal paper. It was a warranty deed filed with the county recorder's office just 3 months prior. My eyes immediately locked onto the property address printed at the top of the page. It was the Savannah Estate. The sprawling historic home with the majestic oak trees. The backyard workshop where I had learned everything about integrity and strength. Mark, acting under the fraudulent power of attorney, had sold his own father's home. I scanned the sales figures. The purchase price was listed at $400,000. I knew the Savannah real estate market intimately. That property, even requiring minor modernization, was worth easily double that amount. They had sold it at a massive, suspicious loss. I looked at the buyer's name, Crestview Commercial Partners. I didn't need to run a database search to recognize that name. It was the primary development firm Mark frequently boasted about partnering with on his social media feeds. They had orchestrated a backroom sweetheart deal, selling the estate for pennies on the dollar to their own associates in exchange for future equity in a new project. Clipped behind the deed was a municipal zoning application. Crestview Commercial Partners had successfully applied to have the historic residential zoning overturned. The attached architectural rendering showed a high-density, aggressively modern condominium complex occupying the exact footprint of the estate. They were not going to preserve the house. They were going to bulldoze the heavy wooden front door. They were going to tear down the oak trees. They were going to completely level the cedar workshop where Walter had taught me how to survive them. They had isolated him in a sterile cell, drained his life savings to buy champagne in Aspen, and sold my only sanctuary to the highest bidder. A strange, absolute calm settled completely over my body. The grief evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating architectural precision. They sold my sanctuary. The sun was just beginning to cast a pale gray light through my apartment blinds when my phone vibrated violently against the drafting table. The screen illuminated, displaying an incoming call from an Aspen, Colorado area code. I stared at the flashing numbers for a long moment, regulating my breathing until my pulse was a steady, rhythmic beat. I picked up the device and pressed accept. Madeline Mark's voice boomed through the speaker, layered with the static of a poor connection and the distinct, arrogant impatience of a man who considers everyone else's time worthless. There was no greeting. There was no inquiry about how I was holding up after burying his father yesterday. "We're looking at the flight schedules," Mark continued, his tone purely transactional. "We won't be back in Savannah for another 2 weeks. This merger is taking all our bandwidth." In the background, I could hear Keelan's sharp voice dictating a room service order. "Listen," Mark said, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial murmur. "I need you to go over to the estate. We need the physical keys to the outbuildings." Keelan remembers a set of vintage, cast-iron lathes in the workshop. Those can fetch a premium price at the architectural salvage auction. I need you to secure them and change the padlocks before the demolition crews arrive next month. We can't have squatters stripping the copper piping before the bulldozers get there. He was asking me to facilitate the looting of my grandfather's grave. He was asking me to sweep up the remnants of the only childhood I ever loved, so he could buy another luxury watch. I didn't scream. I didn't hurl accusations about the forged documents spread across my desk. I kept my voice perfectly flat, perfectly compliant. I understand, Mark, I replied, the syllables tasting like ice. I will handle the inventory of the workshop. You focus entirely on your business in Aspen. I'll make sure everything is exactly where it needs to be. Mark grunted, an acknowledgement entirely satisfied with my apparent submission, and abruptly ended the call. I gave them nothing. I lowered the phone, slowly letting it rest on the edge of the drafting table. The silence in the apartment was deafening, broken only by the steady drumming of the morning rain against the window pane. I looked down at the forged power of attorney, the carbon copies of the stolen savings, and the deed of sale slating my grandfather's legacy for demolition. The sheer, unadulterated sociopathy of the phone call had finally snapped the last fragile thread of the invisible chain that bound me to them. They were not my parents. They were parasites, who had fed on Walter's kindness until there was nothing left but an empty bed in a subsidized memory care unit. There would be no dramatic confrontations. There would be no tearful demands for an apology they were fundamentally incapable of giving. Walter had not left me these documents so I could beg for their remorse. He had left them so I could architect their destruction. They believed they were untouchable because they operated behind layers of corporate LLCs and aggressive legal posturing. But they had made critical structural errors. They had built their new empire on a foundation of fraudulent signatures and expired notary stamps. I picked up a red architectural grading pen and began circling the discrepancies on the bank statements. I was going to dismantle their high society life brick by stolen brick, and I was going to do it completely within the cold, unforgiving boundaries of the law. If you have ever been manipulated by someone who weaponized the concept of family against you, if you deeply believe that no crime can stay buried forever when the math is exposed, please take a second to hit the like button on this video. Your support tells the algorithm that these stories of quiet justice matter. Now the foundation of their crime was exposed, but I needed the ultimate weapon to bring the building down. I reached back into the bottom of the rusted tin tube, my fingers brushing against a thick sealed parchment envelope I had initially overlooked in the darkness. The demolition had begun. The heavy parchment envelope felt thick and substantial in my hands, holding a weight that went far beyond the physical paper inside. I broke the heavy adhesive seal and carefully slid the documents onto the illuminated surface of my drafting table. The thick, textured paper was vastly different from the cheap, easily torn hospital forms Mark and Keelan had utilized. At the very top of the first page, printed in bold, uncompromising black ink, were the words, Walter Foundation Irrevocable Living Trust. In the world of structural engineering and architecture, there are certain load-bearing walls that absolutely cannot be moved, altered, or demolished without bringing the entire massive building down. In the realm of asset protection, an irrevocable trust functions exactly the same way. I read the complex legal terminology, translating it into the pure logic of protection. Walter had not merely updated a simple will. 3 full weeks before Mark and Keelan ever pulled into his gravel driveway in their luxury vehicle, Walter had systematically transferred the absolute legal ownership of his historic Savannah estate, his vast union pension, and his first national bank accounts directly into the strict protection of this trust. The most brilliant, flawless piece of his design was the designated authority. He had named himself as the initial trustee, but the document explicitly stated that upon his passing, or in the event of his physical incapacitation, the sole, unquestionable legal control transferred directly to me. He had essentially built an invisible, impenetrable steel vault around his entire life's work. The fraudulent power of attorney that Mark had aggressively forced him to sign in that bleak hospital room was fundamentally worthless. You cannot legally authorize the sale of a historic property or the transfer of massive cash assets if you no longer legally own them as an individual. Mark and Keelan had spent 8 months eagerly siphoning water from a pool that was already legally drained. They had signed warranty deeds and authorized wire transfers for property and capital that belonged exclusively to the trust. They had not just stolen from an elderly man. They had committed massive, easily provable federal fraud against a protected legal entity. I ran my hand over Walter's bold, steady signature at the bottom of the page. He had engineered a flawless trap, and they had walked blindly into it. The foundation was unbreakable. There was more inside the envelope. I pulled out a stapled medical dossier printed on the official letterhead of a highly prestigious neurological institute in downtown Savannah. It was a comprehensive, deeply thorough psychiatric and cognitive evaluation conducted by a leading board-certified neurologist. The date on the evaluation matched the exact date the irrevocable trust was legally established. The doctor's concluding paragraph was highlighted in yellow ink. It stated unequivocally that Walter possessed absolute perfect cognitive clarity, a total understanding of his vast financial portfolio, and the uncompromised mental capacity to execute binding legal documents. Mark and Keelan had built their entire hostile takeover on the false narrative that Walter was losing his mind. Walter had secured the medical proof that his mind was sharper than theirs. At the very bottom of the heavy envelope, my fingers brushed against something small, hard, and metallic. I tipped the envelope upside down. A small black USB drive clattered onto the wooden drafting table. My pulse remained completely steady. As I plugged the drive into the side of my laptop, a single video file populated on the screen. I clicked play. The video showed Walter sitting in a bright, sunlit conference room, flanked by 3 serious-looking individuals and a woman in a white medical coat. He looked directly into the camera lens. His voice was robust, clear, and totally devoid of hesitation. "My name is Walter," he stated to the camera. "I am executing this irrevocable trust today because I know exactly what my son Mark intends to do. He has spent his life chasing empty wealth. I know his commercial developments are over-leveraged. I know he will view my failing physical health as a financial opportunity. I am making this recording to state with absolute certainty, and under the observation of independent medical and legal counsel, that I am transferring my legacy to my granddaughter Madeline. Any future documents, powers of attorney, or property transfers produced by Mark or his wife Keelan are to be considered products of extreme duress and deliberate fraud." I watched the screen, my chest tightening not with sorrow but with profound, overwhelming respect. He had spent his last months in a sterile, depressing room enduring their patronizing voices and 15-minute visits, knowing the entire time that he held the absolute power to destroy them. He was the master architect. The next morning, I walked into the downtown Savannah offices of Margaret, an attorney who possessed a fearsome, legendary reputation in the highly specialized field of elder law and financial exploitation. Her office smelled of old leather and expensive coffee, a stark contrast to the bleach and despair of Oakwood Haven. I did not waste her time with emotional backstories or dramatic tears. I simply unzipped my leather portfolio, pulled out the contents of the tin drafting tube, and laid the irrevocable trust, the medical evaluation, the IP logs, and the fraudulent bank transfers across her massive mahogany desk. Margaret put on her reading glasses. She spent 45 minutes reviewing the documents in absolute unbroken silence. When she finally looked up, a sharp, genuinely impressed smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Madeline," she said, tapping a manicured fingernail against the trust document. "In 30 years of litigating elder abuse, I have never seen a victim preemptively build the prosecution's entire case with such devastating, flawless precision." I asked her to explain the exact mechanical failure of my parents' strategy. Margaret leaned back in her chair. "Your parents relied on the assumption that a durable power of attorney acts as a blank check. But legally, a power of attorney only grants them the authority to act on behalf of the individual's personal assets. Walter brilliantly removed his assets from his personal ownership." Margaret pointed to the warranty deed Mark had signed to sell the historic estate. "When Mark signed this deed, he committed felony real estate fraud. When Keelan wired $450,000 into her shell company, she committed federal wire theft. Because the trust was already fully funded and legally binding, every single signature they executed was an active, documented crime. Furthermore, the expired notary seal on their initial document shows extreme negligence. We don't just have a civil case for restitution, we have a clear, unarguable path for major criminal indictments." She looked at me, her eyes locking onto mine. "They are going to face decades in a federal facility. The preparation phase is completely finished. The blueprints for their destruction are finalized, and the structural collapse is imminent. If you are ready to watch this building fall, type 'I am ready' in the comments below." I authorized Margaret to begin drafting the subpoenas and to contact the district attorney's specialized fraud unit. I was not going to give them a single warning. The trap was fully armed. 2 weeks later, the Savannah heat was thick and oppressive, but the climate control inside Margaret's high-rise conference room was set to a crisp, freezing temperature. I sat perfectly still at the polished mahogany table, my hands folded neatly over a single unmarked manila folder. Margaret sat beside me, organizing a stack of thick legal briefs. Exactly 15 minutes past the agreed hour, the heavy glass doors swung open. Mark and Keelan strode into the room, bringing the chaotic, arrogant energy of a triumphant corporate victory with them. They had flown in directly from their real estate gala in Aspen, and they were still dressed for the cameras. Keelan carried a vibrant, exotic leather handbag, her posture screaming of misplaced superiority. Mark checked his luxury timepiece before he even pulled out his chair. They believed this meeting was a minor, annoying administrative hurdle. They believed they were here to generously offer me a meager settlement from Walter's personal checking account in exchange for a quiet, uncontested closing of the probate process. Madeline's sweetheart Keelan sighed, settling into her leather chair and offering a deeply condescending, practiced smile. You look incredibly tired. I told you that trying to manage an architectural firm while grieving is simply too much. Let us handle this tedious estate paperwork. Mark didn't bother with the fabricated pleasantries. He leaned his elbows on the polished table, adopting a hard, aggressive negotiating stance. Let's be efficient here, Mark stated, his voice booming in the quiet room. We reviewed the outdated accounts. The old man didn't have much left in liquid capital. The long-term care facility was a massive drain on his limited resources. We are prepared to offer you $25,000 out of our own corporate funds, strictly out of goodwill to help you cover the funeral expenses and get back on your feet. In return, you simply sign a standard waiver, releasing all future claims against the estate. They were offering me $25,000 of my own stolen money to quietly walk away and allow them to keep the remaining $800,000. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice or demonstrate a single ounce of the profound disgust running through my veins. I simply maintained eye contact with Mark, letting the silence stretch out until it became deeply, uncomfortably heavy in the freezing room. The demolition sequence had started. I am not interested in your goodwill, Mark, I said, my voice as level and smooth as freshly poured concrete. I slowly unclasped my hands and opened the manila folder sitting in front of me. I slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany table. It was the public registry printout for Apex Horizon Holdings, LLC. I am, however, highly interested in the structural integrity of your newest commercial development. Mark glanced down at the paper. His expression remained fiercely neutral, but I watched a tiny, almost imperceptible muscle twitch in his jaw. Keelan leaned over to look at the document, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows furrowing in genuine confusion. I don't understand why we are discussing our private commercial entities at an estate closing, Keelan said, her tone sharpening with a sudden defensive edge. This has absolutely nothing to do with Walter. I slid the next document across the table. It was the spreadsheet I had constructed, perfectly aligning the dates of their 15-minute visits to Oakwood Haven with the massive wire transfers. It has exactly $450,000 to do with Walter, I replied smoothly. That is the precise amount of liquid capital you transferred from his First National Savings account directly into your shell company between February and August of last year. The oxygen in the room seemed to instantly vaporize. Keelan's condescending smile vanished, replaced by a rigid, terrified mask. She looked at Mark, waiting for him to deploy his usual corporate aggression to shut the conversation down. You are completely out of your depth, Madeline, Mark growled, pointing a thick finger at the spreadsheet. Your grandfather's cognitive state was rapidly declining. He required highly specialized, aggressive investment strategies to ensure his medical needs were permanently funded. Every single transfer was a calculated, completely authorized maneuver to protect his future. I didn't argue. Arguing validates the lie. I simply pushed the next stack of papers across the polished wood. They were the blue carbon copies Walter had meticulously created, paired perfectly with the IP address logs Margaret had subpoenaed from the bank's security division. The bank logs confirm that 3 of the largest wire transfers were initiated from an IP address, directly tracing back to Keelan's mobile device. Authorized while you were standing over a heavily sedated man. I kept my voice entirely calm, entirely clinical. That is not a specialized investment strategy. That is textbook systematic financial exploitation. They stared at the blue carbon paper. The silence in the freezing conference room was eventually broken by the sheer desperate sound of Keelan pivoting her strategy. When confronted with undeniable hard evidence of their financial crimes, a predator does not immediately surrender. They adapt. Keelan's rigid posture suddenly melted into a deeply fabricated display of maternal sorrow. She reached across the polished mahogany table, attempting to place her manicured hand over mine. I smoothly pulled my hands back, folding them safely in my lap. Undeterred, Keelan's eyes filled with synthetic, unspilled tears. Madeline, please, she whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. You are completely misunderstanding the context of these documents. Your grandfather was terrified of losing his independence. The doctors told us his cognitive decline would eventually require massive round-the-clock medical intervention that his standard pension simply could not cover. We moved those funds into our corporate accounts strictly to shield them from exorbitant facility fees. We were going to use every single penny of that money to build him a private, specialized care suite in one of our new developments. We were trying to save him, sweetheart. We were trying to protect our family. It was a brilliant, horrifyingly plausible narrative crafted with the exact emotional manipulation that had kept me paralyzed for so many months. But I was no longer the 12-year-old girl desperate for a mother's validation. I looked at her, analyzing her performance with the cold detachment of a structural engineer, examining a critically compromised support beam. Before I could respond, Mark decided to deploy the heavy artillery. Recognizing that Keelan's emotional performance was failing to penetrate my calm exterior, he slammed his thick hand violently against the table. The sharp crack made the heavy glass water pitchers vibrate. "Enough of this absolute nonsense," Mark bellowed, his face flushing a deep, furious red. He pointed a menacing finger directly at Margaret, then at me. "You listen to me very carefully, Madeline. I don't care what paranoid scribblings an old dying man managed to trace on a piece of carbon paper. We had complete legal power of attorney. Every action we took was protected by corporate law. If you attempt to take these ridiculous, fabricated accusations to a prosecutor, I will personally file a massive defamation lawsuit against you. I will drag your pristine architectural firm through years of grueling public litigation. I will financially bury you until you cannot afford to draft a blueprint for a doghouse. You do not have the capital or the stamina to fight me." He stood up, buttoning his custom-tailored suit jacket, projecting an aura of absolute untouchable power. He honestly believed he had won. He believed that intimidation volume and the threat of financial ruin would simply force me back into the quiet, compliant submission I had practiced my entire life. He expected me to cry. He expected me to apologize for misunderstanding their brilliant financial strategy. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice a single decibel to match his aggressive volume. I simply looked at him, feeling a profound, absolute sense of peace. They were so incredibly weak. "You are entirely correct about one thing, Mark," I said, my voice completely level, cutting through his aggressive posturing like a scalpel. "You did manage to secure a signature on a durable power of attorney." I slowly reached into the heavy manila folder. The air in the room seemed to pull tight, crackling with an unseen electrical current. I pulled out the thick, textured parchment envelope that had been resting at the very bottom of Walter's rusted tin tube. "The fundamental problem with your structural strategy is that a power of attorney only grants you the legal authority to manipulate assets that the individual actually owns." I slid the heavy document across the polished wood, stopping it exactly halfway between Mark and Keelan. The bold black ink of the title, Walter Foundation Irrevocable Living Trust, stared up at them. Mark's eyes darted to the paper, his aggressive stance faltering for a microscopic fraction of a second. 3 full weeks before you walked into Oakwood Haven and aggressively guided a heavily medicated man's hand across a signature line, I explained calmly. Walter legally transferred the absolute entirety of his estate, including the cash savings and the historic property, into this trust. He named himself the initial trustee, and upon his physical incapacitation, the sole unquestionable authority transferred directly to me. Margaret, sitting perfectly still beside me, finally spoke. Her voice carried the devastating clinical weight of absolute legal certainty. "What Madeline is explaining to you, Mark, is a very basic principle of property law. You cannot authorize the sale of a house that Walter no longer legally owned. You cannot initiate a wire transfer of funds that technically belong to a protected legal entity." She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. "When you signed that warranty deed, you committed felony real estate fraud. When Keelan wired $450,000 into her LLC, she committed federal wire theft. You did not exploit a confused old man. You orchestrated a massive fraud against a federal trust." Mark stared at the parchment document. The vibrant, furious red color slowly drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, pallid gray. Keelan's hand hovered over her exotic leather handbag, trembling visibly. They were seasoned real estate developers. They instantly understood the catastrophic implications of an irrevocable trust. The entire foundation of their theft was utterly void. Every single action they had taken over the past 8 months was not a clever financial maneuver. It was a documented, easily provable felony. They had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars that legally belonged to me. The walls of their empire were cracking, groaning under the immense pressure of their own arrogance. The collapse was absolutely beautiful. In the realm of high-stakes corporate survival, a cornered predator will always launch one final desperate counterattack. Mark's pallid gray complexion hardened back into a mask of pure, vicious survival instinct. He did not apologize. He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a crisp white envelope, tossing it aggressively onto the table. "You really think you are the only one who prepares for structural failures, Madeline," he sneered, his voice dropping to a harsh, guttural whisper. "My legal team filed an emergency injunction in the Superior Court this morning. It effectively freezes every single asset connected to Walter's estate, including your little fabricated trust." He tapped the envelope confidently. We utilized Keelan's original documentation regarding your severe emotional instability. We informed the judge that you have a documented history of paranoid delusions and that you manipulated a dying man into signing over his estate to feed your own mental illness. The injunction holds until a full, multi-year psychiatric evaluation is completed. By the time this untangles in civil court, the money will be completely washed through our offshore developments, and you will be utterly bankrupt paying Margaret's hourly fees. It was a staggering, utterly ruthless display of psychological warfare. They were utilizing my trauma, my quiet nature, and the very lies they had fed the nursing home to permanently lock me out of my own legal inheritance. I looked down at the emergency injunction. A lesser person might have panicked, screamed, or felt the crushing weight of despair. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical satisfaction. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small black USB drive and the stapled psychiatric dossier. I placed them gently on top of Mark's injunction. This, I said quietly, tapping the dossier, is a comprehensive evaluation conducted by the Chief of Neurology at Savannah General Hospital, dated the exact day the trust was signed. It certifies Walter's absolute flawless mental capacity. I pushed the USB drive forward. And this is a video recording of Walter executing the trust witnessed by 3 independent legal professionals and a board-certified psychiatrist. In the video, he explicitly details your exact anticipated strategy of challenging the estate. He names both of you. I looked directly into Mark's eyes, watching the absolute realization of total defeat shatter his arrogance. I submitted these to the district attorney's specialized fraud unit yesterday afternoon. They have already moved to quash your injunction. They are not preparing for a civil dispute, Mark. They are preparing federal criminal indictments. The silence was absolutely deafening. The execution of justice, when properly engineered, does not require dramatic confrontations or screaming matches in a courtroom. It requires patience, precision, and perfect timing. I did not stay to watch Mark and Keelan panic in Margaret's office. I simply stood up, gathered Walter's blueprints, and walked out without saying another word. 2 days later, the trap finally completely snapped shut. Mark and Keelan had desperately flown back to Aspen, hoping to leverage their high society networking gala to secure emergency offshore funding to somehow fight the impending criminal charges. They were standing in a grand chandelier-lit ballroom surrounded by elite developers holding crystal flutes of vintage champagne. According to the detailed timeline Margaret later received from the federal prosecutor, the arrest was flawlessly orchestrated. 4 federal agents wearing sharp, dark suits walked quietly but purposefully into the Aspen ballroom. They did not yell. They did not create a violent scene. They simply approached Mark, and Keelan quietly confirmed their identities and calmly placed cold, heavy steel handcuffs on their wrists in front of 200 of their most crucial financial investors. The clinking of champagne glasses rapidly dissolved into a shocked, echoing silence as my parents were escorted out of the gala, stripped entirely of their manufactured dignity. But the criminal indictments for wire theft and elder exploitation were only the first wave of the structural collapse. The secondary twist that Walter had engineered detonated less than 24 hours later. When the irrevocable trust was legally validated, it triggered a hidden clause regarding the historic Savannah estate. Walter had quietly filed a highly restrictive covenant on the property months before his death, permanently zoning it for historical preservation. The sale Mark had executed to his commercial partners was instantly rendered entirely void. The developers, having already spent millions on demolition permits and architectural redesigns for a high-rise condominium they could no longer legally build, immediately turned around and filed massive multi-million-dollar breach of contract lawsuits directly against Mark and Keelan's LLC. The financial ruin was absolute, multi-layered, and completely inescapable. They had attempted to strip a brilliantly intelligent man of his agency and his wealth. Instead, they had unwittingly funded their own catastrophic, highly public destruction. Their corporate empire, built entirely on manipulation and empty appearances, simply imploded under the heavy, undeniable weight of the truth. The foundation had utterly crumbled. 6 months later, I sat in the polished wooden gallery of a federal courtroom in downtown Atlanta. The air conditioning hummed quietly, a steady clinical background noise to the absolute destruction of a legacy. I sat perfectly upright, my hands resting calmly on the smooth wood of the bench in front of me. Margaret sat 2 rows away, her presence, a silent, solid pillar of support. Through the heavy double doors, Mark and Keelan were escorted into the room. They were no longer wearing custom-tailored Italian suits or displaying expensive, exotic leather accessories. They wore the bleak uniform beige of the federal detention system. Their posture had completely collapsed. The arrogant, untouchable aura they had projected for decades had been entirely stripped away by the relentless grinding machinery of the justice system. When Keelan briefly turned her head and saw me sitting in the gallery, her eyes widened. She instinctively opened her mouth, attempting to form the shape of an apology, attempting to deploy the maternal manipulation that had previously kept me compliant. I did not offer her a single ounce of validation. I did not look away, nor did I project anger. I simply looked through her, viewing her not as a mother but as a compromised, failing structure that had finally been condemned. Society consistently tells us that cutting ties with our own blood is a profound failure of compassion. We are aggressively conditioned to believe that forgiveness is a mandatory toll we must pay to exist within a biological family. But as I watched the judge hand down their sentences, multiple years in federal prison, coupled with total devastating financial restitution, I realized the profound danger of that toxic narrative. Sometimes the most courageous, necessary act of preservation is to completely demolish a toxic foundation. Sending the people who biologically created me to prison was not an act of vindictive bitterness. It was the establishment of an absolute uncrossable boundary. It was the final necessary step in honoring the man who had actually shown up to raise me. As the bailiff led them out of the courtroom to begin their sentences, I felt the heavy, invisible psychological chain that had bound me to their approval finally definitively snap. I did not owe them my silence. I did not owe them my suffering. I owed them absolutely nothing. I stood up from the wooden bench, smoothed the fabric of my coat, and walked out of the heavy courtroom doors into the bright, blinding Georgia sunlight. I was completely, utterly free. It took 14 months to fully untangle the complex legal and financial wreckage Mark and Keelan had deliberately left behind. But the legal system, when properly supplied with undeniable, heavily authenticated documentation, is a remarkably efficient machine. The federal courts executed the mandatory restitution orders without an ounce of hesitation, systematically liquidating my parents' remaining corporate assets, their luxury vehicles, and their Aspen investment portfolios. They forcefully returned the stolen $450,000 directly back to the Walter Foundation Irrevocable Trust. The fraudulent backroom sale of the historic Savannah estate was officially reversed by a superior court judge. The property was finally legally secure, or rather, it belonged entirely to the trust, which I now directed with absolute authority. I did not move into the grand formal bedrooms of the main house. Instead, I immediately began drafting the comprehensive blueprints for a massive architectural preservation project. I hired local independent contractors, prioritizing the retired union carpenters who had proudly worked alongside Walter decades ago. We did not tear down the heavy wooden front door. We meticulously restored its original weathered brass hinges. We did not pave over the sweeping oak trees. We brought in arborists to reinforce the soil and secure their sprawling historic branches. But the most important reconstruction happened in the backyard. I walked into Walter's old cedar workshop on a quiet Tuesday morning. The air inside was still and heavy, holding the faint, ghost-like scent of old paper and dried wood stain. I walked over to his massive wooden drafting table. I ran my hand across the smooth, worn surface, brushing away a thin layer of dust. This was the exact spot where he had taught a discarded, heartbroken 12-year-old girl how to systematically build a strong foundation. I utilized the recovered trust funds to officially launch the Walter Foundation Vocational Center. We partnered directly with local foster care agencies and group homes, specifically seeking out teenagers who felt entirely abandoned and disconnected from society. We brought them into the workshop. We put high-quality professional drafting pencils and heavy woodworking tools into their hands. I teach them the exact same lesson Walter taught me, that a physical structure is only as reliable as the raw materials you choose to support it. And human beings operate on the exact same principle. I watch them measure, calculate, and build. I see their tense shoulders slowly relax. I see the invisible, heavy chains of their past trauma slowly begin to dissolve in the absolute safety of this workshop. The estate is no longer a silent, echoing monument to a stolen legacy. It is vibrant and alive. It smells strongly of fresh cedar shavings, hot coffee, and newly poured concrete. It sounds like the steady, relentless hum of progress, and the bright, unburdened laughter of children who finally feel secure. The foundation is finally safe. My name is Madeline. I am 32 years old and I am a preservation architect. 2 years ago, I stood completely alone in the freezing rain to bury my grandfather, the only true parent I ever possessed. Today, the two people who biologically created me are sitting in separate federal correctional facilities, stripped entirely of their wealth, their social standing, and their manufactured corporate empires. They will spend the next decade paying back the massive financial restitution they owe to this foundation. Their future wages forcefully garnished their remaining assets, completely dissolved by the state. Justice has been executed with absolute mathematical precision. The courts handled the punishment, but the true lasting victory did not happen in front of a federal judge. The true victory happens every single morning when I walk onto this historic estate, breathe in the rich scent of aged cedar, and open a brand new set of architectural blueprints. Mark and Keelan truly believed that power was derived exclusively from manipulation, secrecy, and aggressive financial leverage. They believed that because I was quiet and compliant, I was fundamentally weak. They made the fatal, arrogant error of confusing volume with structural strength. Walter knew better. He understood that true power is entirely silent. It lives in the meticulous, patient documentation of the absolute truth. It lives in the quiet resilience of a child who actively refuses to internalize the profound cruelty of her parents. It lives in the absolute certainty that no amount of expensive public relations or aggressive legal posturing can ever defeat a perfectly engineered foundation of facts. They tried to bury him in a sterile, forgotten room. They tried to erase his legacy to fund their own superficial lives. But Walter did not just build houses, he built me. He left behind a master blueprint for justice, and he completely trusted me to execute the final design. Legacy is not what you passively inherit from the people who happen to share your bloodline. Legacy is what you possess, the profound, unshakable courage to protect, to rebuild, and to pass on to those who genuinely need it. Blood merely makes you related, but integrity, loyalty, and showing up when it absolutely matters, that is what actually makes you a family. I am sitting at Walter's drafting table right now, looking out the large glass window at a group of teenagers, learning how to frame a new greenhouse. The sun is shining brightly through the sweeping branches of the oak trees. If you are currently fighting a quiet, desperate battle against toxic family members who use guilt and obligation as weapons, I want you to know that you do not have to accept their narrative. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to protect yourself. The truth is your absolute most powerful asset. Document everything, hold your ground, and never let them convince you that your foundation is weak. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who might desperately need to hear it today. Stay strong. Keep building your truth.